Well, we just got reporting again, and this is again from the correspondents that are on the ground. The CNN correspondent reports now citing the Ukrainian Interior Ministry saying that explosions are being heard near Kyiv, and those explosions are missile strikes. Now, we can't confirm this, but if indeed missile strikes are being heard as close as the Interior Ministry of Ukraine is claiming, then of course it's already happening. If we go by the intelligence that the Biden administration has been sharing for weeks and months, then this is a full-on invasion that Vladimir Putin has been planning. Generals, military officials, when usually everyone is unified in saying that something is going to happen, we tend to believe them. But I think what's also very important is what Vladimir Putin mentioned during that long speech a few days ago, sort of his manifesto. I mean, if we really listen to him and his sort of distortion of history, we really did we did get an understanding that, first of all, he doesn't want just Donbass, and he's not really just thinking about Kyiv and Ukraine only. He's really thinking about really reconstructing the security apparatus of Europe in general, and I think that's where the real dangers lie ultimately. And it's really the start of a new era right now as we're talking and as we're speaking. And I think Vladimir Putin does have wider implication and wider aspirations. And we ask why he's doing it, and I think the answer is because he thinks he can.
Absolutely. I think that is a very crucial aspect of this entire thing that is playing out, because Vladimir Putin does believe that he can do this. In 2014, the Russian troops swooped in and annexed Crimea with virtually little resistance from the West. Things people hoped would be different this time around. Ukraine, because of the diplomatic efforts that were ongoing over the course of the last several weeks, would have been hoping that things had been different this time around. But Ray Locker, if I can bring you in on this, the fact of the matter is, at this point of time, despite the hectic diplomatic efforts that were witnessed over the course of the last weeks, Ukraine, at this point of time, is looking at the possibility of a Russian incursion, because we are looking at reports that say that missile strikes, these are according to media reports, that missile strikes are being carried out. There were explosions that are being reported near Kyiv and in Kyiv, and these are now being said to be missile strikes. This clearly points to the intention of the Russians, where the military operation is not going to be limited to the Donbas region.
Not just Donbass, it's the whole country. And Putin wants to control Ukraine. I mean, that's obvious. And what kind of diplomatic efforts are we going to see? I mean, you can say, don't do it, we're going to sanction you. And if he invades anyways, he's going to. I mean, the only thing that would get Putin to not invade Ukraine, which is too late now, would be to give him something. And what would that be? The Donbass, something else? That's the only way that he would not invade. You give him something that he wants. And that didn't happen, so now he's invaded.
Yeah, but quite clearly, Russia had said that it wants guarantees that Ukraine would not be a part of the NATO military alliance. If the West is not willing to do that, we're looking at a situation where Russia would be willing to annex one more region from Ukraine. This is, to put it, as it is, this is the dismemberment of Ukraine that we're looking at. If Russia again claims the Donbas region, it has claimed Crimea earlier, and this can, of course, continue to go on.
Well, yeah, that's exact. Look, the whole reason Ukraine wanted to join NATO, the reason any country wants to join NATO, is defend itself against Russia. And so Putin's like, don't join NATO because we don't want you to defend yourself. We don't want you to have help when we invade you. It wasn't that NATO was threatening Russia. It was that NATO was stopping Putin from doing what he wanted. And so he's going to do what he wants anyway. And now it's up to the West to decide whether they're going to sanction him in a way that's going to cripple the Russian economy and ripple through the global economy. And that's probably the only thing that's going to get him to stop doing what he's doing. And that what will embolden him further are the reactions by people here in the United States who are saying that somehow we're doing Vladimir Putin wrong by sanctioning him and his cronies. And it's madness. I mean, it's absolutely insane when you watch what's happening.
Absolutely. It's difficult to, in fact, at this point of time, comprehend as to what this could, of course, lead to. Because wars often happen because of miscalculations by the politicians. They raise the stakes and then they do not know how to climb back down. Siddhant, if I can bring you in on this, this announcement by the Russians, and also the fact that we are hearing explosions which are now said to be missile strikes that are being carried out deep into the heart of Ukrainian territory. All of these have happened at a time when the UNSC is of course meeting in New York. Does this mean that Vladimir Putin has complete disregard for the UNSC?
Well, yes, it essentially means that Putin does not care about what the West has been doing. And in fact, it was around 6 a.m. in the morning in Moscow when the announcement was being made. And exactly at the same time, at 10 p.m. in New York, the UNSC was meeting. So it is a message in itself. And also remember that Russia is the president of the United Nations Security Council. So you have a certain kind of when it comes to the bureaucracy at the Security Council, you have a certain lead on that. But largely when it comes to what India has said at the Security Council, calling for restraint, but also remember this time, for perhaps the first time, India has not mentioned the Minsk Pact, the Normandy talks, something that has been a permanent fixture of the speech by the Indian envoy to the United Nations in the past few meetings on the Ukraine crisis. But of course, emphasis on the Indian national. Now, talking about the Indian national, and this is significant because remember, today was the day when the second Air India flight was to go to Kyiv to bring back the Indian national. Now, we know that the airspace over Ukraine has been closed, and now it will be a worry for New Delhi because remember, there are 20,000 Indian nationals in the country. Most of them are students. So
Right.
New Delhi's concern right now is to bring back those Indians.
Absolutely, indeed. That, of course, is going to be a task cut out for India. 20,000 Indian nationals, as you mentioned, most of them students who are presently in Ukraine, as the Russian president has, of course, declared a military operation. Susan, you've been tracking the developments very closely from New York. The United Nations Security Council is presently in session, and that is when we are told that these explosions have been reported in Kyiv, which are now being said to be missile strikes that have been carried out. And you also told us about the statement that's been put out by the American president, where he has accused the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, of a premeditated war that will have catastrophic consequences and human suffering. At this point of time, the United States and its allies in the NATO, besides the financial sanctions that they've been mulling about and that they've announced, is there anything else that the West can realistically do at this point of time that would warn off Vladimir Putin from a bigger operation in Ukraine?
This is the tools that the Biden administration put forward and said that this is the path we're going to take, and if Russia invades, we're going to hit it with hard-hitting sanctions. The problem is that the red line was drawn in the beginning that if one troop goes into Ukraine, then these sanctions would, initially going to be, sanctions that Russia has never seen before. So when the first, part of the invasion happened, then we heard that it was the start of the invasion, then the start of sanctions, then we heard that, some of the individuals that the Biden administration sanctioned just yesterday or the day before had already been sanctioned. Now their relatives are being sanctioned. The sanctions will work if they were the sanctions that were initially announced. But little by little, we're hearing that some of them are not going to work. For example,
Susan, I'll have to interrupt you there because I'm told that the Russian representative of the UNSC is, of course, addressing the UNSC. Let's listen to what's being said.
Speakers on the list. This meeting is adjourned.
All right, we'll try and get that statement by the Russian representative, the president at the UNSC. But Susan, we were talking about, the costs which the United States can impose on Russia that would ward off the Russians from indulging in a bigger operation in Ukraine. At this point of time, and this is something that we've been talking about for the last several weeks now. When push comes to shove, a lot of commentators had said that Ukraine will be on its own. It is not a member of the NATO alliance, and therefore the United States and other members of NATO are not duty-bound to defend Ukraine in case of a military incursion. The entire conflict, according to the Russians, is because they believe that Ukraine could join the NATO military alliance sometime in the near future. NATO does not want to shut off the door for Ukraine, but at this point of time, Ukraine finds itself in a situation where it may have to take on the Russians virtually on their own. There could be help for the Ukrainians, in some ways of military equipment being given to the Ukrainians by the West. But otherwise, we're looking at a situation where Ukraine will have to deal with this Russian incursion virtually on its own.
Absolutely, and first of all, the United States has made clear that it's not going to send U.S. troops there, which I think everyone in unison is in agreement with. There isn't an appetite for that here in the United States, definitely. But I think the question right now and the debate is whether or not the United States and NATO was basically loyal enough in arming Ukraine enough in being able to defend itself against a Russian aggression. And that's the question that remains. Was it able to really provide those lethal weapons, considering the fact that, Ukraine voluntarily gave up its nuclear weapons, gave up its defense weapons and its nuclear weapons years ago in an agreement, and so it basically trusted the United States, the UK, and Russia, and here it is right now. And you're right, it is going to be fighting alone. And I think the question is whether or not, to what extent the United States and its allies can help Ukraine. That's on the defensive side. But as I was saying, these sanctions that are being imposed, I think ultimately the one that was really important that might have deterred Vladimir Putin was maybe throwing off Russia off the financial banking system, the SWIFT. And that's out of the question right now. And part of the reason for that is something that we've been talking about, is the rift between the Europeans and because countries like Austria, the Netherlands, and France themselves, they have lines of credit open with Russia. And if Russia is thrown off the SWIFT banking system, then they would be affected essentially as well. So that's not going to work. And that was probably the biggest winning card in the West's hand. So then it leaves them with other options that might perhaps deter Vladimir Putin. We've already mentioned that we're not going to touch the oil and gas sector of the Russian economy. Okay, so that's off the table as well. Then it goes to the banking system. We made a very big deal about, the sanctions that we did impose right now. Well, apparently they didn't work. So we'll have to wait and see what the Biden administration, what other diplomatic tools it has in its coffers. But you're right. I think Ukraine is wondering right now, ultimately, will its soldiers have to go to the battlefield on its own? And whether or not it was smart in giving up its nuclear weapons on the one hand, and whether or not other countries...
At the General Assembly today, we have heard from the UN Secretary General, who stated that the decision of the Russian Federation to recognize the so-called independence of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions is a violation of the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine and inconsistent with the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. It undermines the United Nations itself. The UN should not share the fate of the League of Nations. The Secretary General also made clear his concern about the perversion of the concept of peacekeeping. Troops entering the territory of another country without its consent are not impartial peacekeepers, nor are they peacekeepers at all, as he pointed out. They are called invaders. Yet we note today that these persistent calls for the respect of international law, diplomacy and dialogue continue to be unheeded. We underline that the Russian Federation's use of force against Ukraine is completely unjustified and unacceptable. It must be met with unity, firmness and determination in solidarity with Ukraine. The European Union has responded to the latest violations, including with additional restrictive measures. We stand ready to adopt more wide-ranging political and economic sanctions. Russia's actions against Ukraine are not a matter just for Ukraine or for Europe. They have severe implications globally for every UN member state and the rules-based international order. We urge the Russian Federation, as a party to the conflict, to reverse the recognition of the so-called People's Republics, uphold its commitments, abide by international law, and return to the discussions within the Normandy format and the Trilateral Contact Group. It has a clear responsibility under international law to work to find a peaceful settlement of the conflict. We strongly urge Russia to respect the principles of the UN Charter, to refrain from any further escalatory actions, and to engage in meaningful diplomacy. We reiterate the unwavering support of Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania for Ukraine's sovereignty, independence and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. We, with the international community, stand in solidarity with Ukraine. Thank you.
That, of course, is the statement at the UNSC stating that the world stands in solidarity with the people in Ukraine. But for the people in Ukraine, they would want more than solidarity, of course, at this point of time. Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General, is now addressing
the saddest moment in my tenure as Secretary General of the United Nations. I started this meeting of the Security Council addressing President Putin and telling him from the bottom of my heart, stop your troops from an offensive to Ukraine, give peace a chance because too many people have already died. During the meeting, President Putin announced a special military operation in the Donbass and required the Ukrainian troops to lay down their arms. So in the present circumstances, I must change my appeal. And I must say, President Putin, in the name of humanity, bring your troops back to Russia. In the name of humanity, do not allow to start in Europe what could be the worst war since the beginning of the century, with consequences not only devastating for Ukraine, not only tragic for the Russian Federation, but with an impact we cannot even foresee in relation to their consequences for the global economy in a moment when we are emerging from the COVID, and so many developing countries absolutely need to have space for the recovery, which would be very, very difficult with the high prices of oil, with the end of exports of wheat from the Ukraine, and with rising interest rates caused by the instability in international markets. This conflict must stop now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary General. You've just talked about consequences I wonder if you could spell out some more what you think the consequences will be for Russia and for Ukraine and its people.
Well, it's clear that military action will be happening in the territory of Ukraine. And obviously, if they lead to a generalized war, it is difficult to forecast how dramatic it will be in the number of people who will die, in the number of people who will be displaced, in the number of people who will lose hope in relation to the future. It is also clear that the consequences for the Russian Federation will be very meaningful. It's not for me to comment on sanctions that are being implemented, but it's clear that there will be also consequences. But what is clear for me is that this war doesn't make any sense. It violates the principles of the Charter, and it causes, or will cause, if it doesn't stop, a level of suffering Europe has not known since at least the volcanic crisis.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary General. Pam Falk from CBS News. Is there anything the UN can do to get Russia back to the bargaining table at this point?
We can, of course, in my case, appeal. The Security Council is the body that has the powers given by the Charter to address this situation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.